Beautiful story. And Esther was she was an orphan raised by her uncle, Mordecai, or her cousin actually, and he brought her up, and she was a beautiful young lady. And as King Xerxes banned his prior queen because she didn't want to be paraded around, can't blame her for that, and he banned her from the kingdom and his presence, and then he went on a search to find the future bride, and they went out throughout the land, and then they brought all these maidens in and these virgins in, and for 3 years they were preparing them, getting ready to see the king. So this is how Esther comes in. She's chosen by the king to be the next bride, and Esther is rising up. And something terrible happens. We have the other man here in the story is Haman. And Haman is a man who was rising to power in King Xerxes' eyes. And he's rising to power, and he turns around, and he doesn't like Mordecai because when he comes out in the king's court, Mordecai won't bow to him, he won't kneel, and he doesn't give him the homage that he felt he deserved. So from that, he was mad at Mordecai. I want to explain that a little bit so you understand why Mordecai wouldn't bow to him. So, and we don't need to go to scripture on this. I'm just going to read it to you. So in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 17, remember what the Amalekites. So Haman was an Amalekite. His descendant was an Amalekite. And he says, remember what the Amalekites did to you along the way when you came out of Egypt. When they were weary and worn, when you were weary and worn out, they met you on the journey, and they attacked all who were lagging behind. They had no fear of God. When the Lord your God gives you rest from all your enemies around you, and the land he's given to you in the possession of your inheritance, he shall blot out the name of the Amalekites from under heaven. Do not forget. So what happens is when they were coming out of Egypt, and you've heard me say this before, the Amalekites were trailing along, the older ladies and the pregnant women and all the children were coming from the back of the band, and the Amalekites, they came and they would kill them. They would kill the kids and the women and the children. So here in Deuteronomy, he says that God's plan was to annihilate them, kill them, make them extinct. In 1 Samuel 15:20, it says, but I did not obey the Lord, Saul said. I went on a mission. He says, but I did obey the Lord, Saul said. And he was lying to the prophet when he was confronting him. He says, I went on the mission the Lord assigned me. I completely destroyed the Amalekites and brought Agag, their king. Again, Amalekites, King Agag was the king at the time. Haman is from this tribe. And finally in Exodus 17:16, he said, because hands were lifted up against the throne of the Lord will be at war against the Amalekites from generation to generation. So as you can see, a lot of people weren't understanding if Mordecai would have just kneeled and he would have praised him, none of this would have happened. But Mordecai knew the gospel, he knew God, he knew the history of the people, and he wasn't going to kneel down to him. Mordecai was saving his praise and his worship for the one true God, the God that deserved it, the God that was honored by that. And he wasn't kneeling before the Amalekites. He wasn't going to do it. So he wasn't doing anything wrong. But in that time, if the king appointed someone, you're supposed to show them the honor. But Mordecai knew that his honor and his knees and his praise was reserved for one thing, and that's for God. And it's a lesson in itself right there. You could preach a whole sermon on that, because it really contests to us that our praise, our worship, our time, our devotion should be what? To the one true God. But we know today so many things replace that. So many things come in our life and become another God. And, for a lot of this, and you hear me say this, is it TikTok or Facebook or what have you, and it becomes a pseudo God. It becomes something that sucks up our time, and we're involved. And I say this to a lot of people, say, if you take this thing and you say, well, if I spend X amount of hours or time on it, we'll take that time and the same amount of time and give it to God in prayer. And I say, whoa, that's hours. And I don't pray for hours, but I'll take hours finding another idol in my life. And that's what Haman is saying here, that his praise and worship and his knee and his royalty was for the one true God. So that's how all this started, because Mordecai wouldn't bow to Haman. And I just gave you a little history so you understood why. So Esther, she's in the king's castle, and Mordecai has a sackcloth, and he's out in the courtyard, and he has ashes, and he's worshiping, and he's coming, and he's crying out loud, and he's saying to everyone, hey, that there's a decree passed by king, and they want to kill all the Jews. And he's wailing, and he's crying out of that, and Esther's saying, hey, go tell Uncle Mordecai to stop, because they're going to draw attention to him. He's going to get his head cut off. And she's saying, tell him to stop. And she sends one of the eunuchs to go talk to him. And Uncle Mordecai goes back and responds to her, I'm not stopping. And he says, not only am I not stopping, Esther, you need to start. And he's reminding her, and that's a whole other thing too. A whole other sermon there is when we look at that, a verse that's very popular is verse 14, where she says, but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. For such a time as this, that God has born you. And what a perfect day to come when this young lady is talking to us about life, Each one of those kids that are being aborted are denied that man thinks that we have the virtue to say, well, I'm going to stop it. And God says, no, I'm the only one who can create it, and I'm the only one who can stop it. So what a perfect time that we're in sync with this. And we see this, that Mordecai is saying, hey, and Esther's there saying, I don't know, Mordecai, if I go to the king without being called, and if he doesn't accept me, I'm killed. He's going to kill me. And by the way, did you hear what happened to his first wife? He banned her from the kingdom. And he's saying to her, but you have come to your royal position for such a time as this, right now. But you know what, folks? That's each and every one of us. Each and every one of us. Talked to Darren, and Darren's not a big fan of being in front of crowds or the center of attention. And I said, I'm thinking, you lead worship, you know. and this is a true story. I'm good on one-to-one or a group of 5 or 6, but I hate being in front of people. You know, when I first started pastoring, I would have to bring 5 T-shirts because I would just sweat and soak through them, and I was so nervous. And I thought, Lord, why are you calling me? I don't even like people that much. You got the wrong person. It can't be me. But he brings that passion. He brings that love. And we do it. Why? Because you're called. So such a time as this, it's for you. He's talking about your life. And he's talking about your involvement in other people's lives. And he's saying, guess what? Sometimes you're going to have to get dirty. And sometimes you're going to have to get involved. And sometimes it's going to cost you monetarily. Sometimes it's going to cost you your investment. But he's saying, hey, Esther, it's not okay to do nothing. And doing nothing's not an option. So Uncle Mordecai is telling her, no, that's not okay. Verse 16, and then Esther turns around. She says, I'm going to take the people who are close to me. We're going to pray. We're going to fast. And we're going to wait on God. And we're going to do something. She says, we're going to do something. Verse 16, go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me and do not eat or drink for 3 days, nights. She's waiting for an answer. And she wanted God's blessing and anointing. And finally, she turns around and she says, when this is done, I will go to the king, even though it's against the law. And if I perish, I perish. So Esther was finally saying, Lord, not my will, Lord, but your will be done. And Lord, have your way. And I'm going to listen. Now we're going to go to chapter 5. And then I have some readers for 6 and 7. We're going to go quickly. So we are on chapter 5. This is part 2. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes, and she stood in the inner court. So finally, I'm going to paraphrase some of this. Esther is getting ready to go talk to the king. This is the big moment, because if the king doesn't recognize her, if he doesn't tell her, and he doesn't hold out his golden scepter and tell her you can come, then she can be banned or her head could be cut off. Verse 2, when he seen Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her, and he held out the gold scepter that was in his hand. So Esther, she came and she approached her, she came forward. Then then the king asked, what is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? And he says, you've been up to half the king. What do you need, Esther? What brought you here? So, verse 4 is very important. And this is the first time. So remember, Haman has a decree written by the king. He signs it with his signet ring that all the Jews are going to be killed, as well as the women and their children, and you can take all their possessions. So a decree was written, and the king approved it. All this was taking place, but now here comes a story, and it's picking up pace. Now Mark, the first invite is in verse 4, and she says, if it pleases the king, replied Esther, let the king, together with Haman, come today to a banquet. She says, I'm going to have a party, I'm going to have a banquet for you. Verse 5, bring Haman. So Haman is the culprit. He's the one who's hooked all this up, and he's going to have all the Jews, not just Mordecai, but all the Jews annihilated, erased. So he says, but she says, also bring Haman. And the king says, go get Haman. Go get him right now and bring him, because Esther is going to have a banquet for us. So, number 1, and then we go all the way down to verse 8. And it says, if the king regards me with favor, and if it pleases the king to grant me my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow. So here's what's interesting. Verse 4, she makes the plea. She says she's going to have a banquet, but nothing happens. It goes down to verse 8. And now the king is there, and she says again, well, if the king regards me with favor, and if it pleases the king, grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow. Now, and then, verse 9, Haman went out that day and in high spirits, but when he saw Mordecai at the king's gate, he observed that he neither rose nor showed fear in his presence. He was filled with rage against Mordecai. And we explained to you why Mordecai would not bow to him. Verse 11, Haman boasted to them about his vast wealth. So Haman goes home, and he tells his wife, Zeresh, and all his buddies, he's saying, I have it made. Life is good. And I'm right up there with the king. And he's recognizing me. He's my buddy. He's empowered me. But he goes on. He goes, but there's this Jew, this Mordecai. He will not stand. He will not bow. And I got an issue with that. He's angry. In verse 11, it says, Haman boasted to them about his vast wealth with his many sons and the way the king had honored him and how he had elevated him above all the other nobles and officers. And then verse 12, he says, hey, that's not all. He says, the Queen Esther, she's in company. She asked me to come to a banquet. But we know the banquet is to divulge what Haman is about. Verse 13, but all this gives me no satisfaction. Now this is Haman talking. As long as I see that Jew, that Mordecai, sitting in the king's gate. So he goes home, verse 14, and he tells Zeresh, his wife, and all the friends that are there, he said, I am in a perfect place. I'm raised to power, authority. I have money. Things are great. But that Mordecai, man, he's under my skin. And then he goes on, he's telling Zeresh, his wife, and his friends, and she says, well, have a pole set up reaching to a height of 50 cubits. 50 cubits is 75 feet. And ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai impaled on it. Then go to the king and to the banquet and enjoy yourself. Get rid of that Mordecai. This suggestion delighted Haman, and he had a pole set up. So this is how we begin. Chapter 6.
That night the king could not sleep, so he ordered the book of the Chronicles, the record of his reign, to be brought in and read to him. It was found recorded that there was Mordecai had exposed both Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who have guarded the doorway, who had conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. What honor and recognition had Mordecai received for this? The king asked. Nothing had been done for him, his attendants answered. The king said, Who is in the court? Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the palace to speak to the king about impaling Mordecai on the pole he had set up for him. His attendants answered, Haman is standing in the court. Bring him in, the king ordered. When Haman entered, the king asked, What should be done for the man the king delights to honor? Now Haman thought to himself, Who is there that the king would rather honor than me? So he answered the king, For the man delights to honor, have them bring a royal robe the king has worn, and a horse the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on his head. Then let the robe and the horse be entrusted to the one the king most noble prince. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor, and lead him on a horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. Go at once, the king commanded Haman. Get the robe and the horse, and do just as you suggested for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything you have recommended. So Haman got the robe and the horse. He robed Mordecai and led him on horseback through the city streets, proclaiming before him, This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. Afterward, Mordecai returns to the king's gate, but Haman rushed home, with his head covered in grief. He told Xerxes, his wife, and all of his friends everything that had happened to him. His advisors and his wife Xerxes said to him, Since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is of Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin. While they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried Haman away to the banquet Esther had prepared.
Esther chapter 7. So the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet, and as they were drinking wine on the second day, the king again asked, Queen Esther, what is your petition? It will be given you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted. Then Queen Esther answered, If I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition. And spare my people, this is my request. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. If we have merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king. King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, Who is he? Where is he, the man who is declared to do such a thing? Esther said, An adversary and enemy, this vile Haman. Then Haman was terrified before the king and queen. The king got up in a rage, left his wine, and went out into the palace garden. But Haman, realizing that the king had already decided his fate, stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life. Just as the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was reclining. The king exclaimed, Will he even molest the queen while she is with me in the house? As soon as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbana, one of the eunuchs attending the king, said, A pole reaching to a height of 50 cubits stands by Haman's house. He had it set up for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king. The king said, Impale him on it. So they impaled Haman on the pole he had set up for Mordecai. Then the king's fury subsided.
Thank you, both of you gentlemen, for reading. Thank you. Yeah, give them both a hand. That's a great idea. So, a quick recap. Chapter 6, we see that King Xerxes, he's in bed, he can't sleep, and he says, Hey, give me a boring book, and they bring him the Chronicles. Chronicles are a record of his reign. This is a pretty prideful king. Remember, he threw a party for 6 months to show how powerful and great he was. So he says, well, bring these Chronicles. I want to read about what a great king I am. And after he's reading the Chronicles, he reads about Mordecai. Now, Mordecai, remember, Haman's coming, and Haman's in the court, coming to tell the king, we got to hang this Mordecai, and we got to impale him on this pole, 75 feet up in the air, and he's out in the out in the court, and he's coming to see the king. And the king's reading these chronicles, and he says to his eunuch, he says, hey, this Mordecai, this man who saved my life, and he told us about these two people who were going to kill him. He says, listen, did we ever do anything for this Mordecai? And they said, nope. And he says, well, we need to. So he wanted counsel. So he was looking around, and he says, hey, who's here to help me out? And they said, well, they're looking through the window, and they're saying, Haman, he's out there. Now, Haman has a different agenda. He wants to impale Mordecai on the pole. He says, bring Haman up here. So Haman comes up. Remember, he's second in command. Says, Haman, what do you think? He says, I think what? And he doesn't tell him what he's talking about. He's saying, hey, Haman, if I have a man who saved my life, and Haman's think he's talking about him, but he's talking about Xerxes, right? Sorry, he's talking about who? Mordecai. So Haman's like, he's not knowing. He says, Haman, what do you think I should do? And he goes, I'll tell you what, get a beautiful horse, your most royal prized possession, and put a beautiful robe on him, and put him on this horse, and walk him through the kingdom. And he says, and tell everybody that this is how the king honors son. But he's talking about who? Mordecai. But Haman thinks he's talking about him. And he gets done, he says, Haman, man, that's such a great idea. Go get that horse and go get Mordecai. Haman hates Mordecai. But here's what you got to understand. God's divine purpose. God is setting all this up. It's incredible. But what you need to be thinking is about your life. You need to be thinking about your life. And why is life so precious? Because we have a divine purpose. We have a divine reason that God says, I got a reason for you here. I brought you here by my design. And I told you this before, and I'm going to say this again. At first, when we were job searching, and Rhonda brought up Ogden, and she brought up a picture of Ogden, I seen a truck going over the tracks over here, and we seen your grocery store on fire. And I said, why are we going there? Why are we going? And I said, is God mad at me? And I'm like, and then I'm searching, and I'm thinking, why am I going to Iowa? Right? So I wasn't going to Iowa, but I said I was going to come and preach in Iowa. Well, God saved my life. I had 4 bypasses, and I was in Ohio. I had an interview in Ohio and accepted a job there, but I promised that we were going to come here. Now here, I'm going somewhere this. God's divine appointment was different than my plans. My plans was, I was going to Ohio. I was going to work with my old buddy. We're going to start a Christian KOA. I've always wanted to do that. And it paid big bucks. And I didn't have to deal with people all the time. This was the ideal job. And I told Rhonda, we're going. But when I found out that I had to go and have a bypass, they thought I only needed a couple. Ended up I needed 4. And I turned around, and God had birthed Ogden, Iowa in my spirit. All I could think, Ogden, Iowa saved my life. Because all I could say to the surgeon was, listen, if you need to crack me open, if you need to do this, let's do it right away. And he's like, well, wait a minute, you don't understand. This is complicated. I said, yeah, but I got to preach in Ogden, Iowa. And he laughed, and he says, you're never going to Ogden, Iowa. You got to be sitting down and relaxing for 6-7 weeks. You're not going to Ogden. But God said, you're going to Ogden, Iowa. But Ogden, Iowa, they didn't know what was going on. We didn't tell you. God's divine purpose, his divine plan, God's divine purpose, God's divine plan. I want you to all wake up on this. We've grown 75 people plus, including kids and moms and dads, because God is doing something special here. God is stirring, and he's bringing unity, and some of the town is scratching their head and saying, who is that troublemaker? But you know what? God's divine purpose is happening right here. It's happening in front of us, and we're part of it. And we're part of it because God had a divine timing. He had a divine purpose. And some of us are part of it, don't even know what's going on. We need to wake up and say, God, you're doing something here. This isn't an accident. This is God's divine hand. This is his purpose. And Mr. Coleman, Mrs. Coleman, you're here by purpose. And your kids. God's divine purpose, his calling, And God is saying, listen, we're going to do something here. And we're moving, and God's Spirit is moving. But you know what? It started on a bar stool. It started with a young pastor when I said, Lord, I don't want to be a pastor. And I ran, and I ran, and I ran, and I ran, and I ran. And my wife and I got in a big argument one night. She said, you need to do what God's calling you to do so I can do what I got to do. I remind her every time she complains. So I say, hey, I'm doing what I got to do so you can do what God called you to do. So here's the thing. When we see the story, it's about God's intervention. It's about God's purpose. But remember what happened to Esther. Esther had to submit. She had to say, I got to do something. And Uncle Mordecai is reminding me, I got skin in the game. Something has to happen here. And because something has to happen, and because I have to have skin in the game, she had to submit her life. What was it going to cost her? Her life. When we serve God, you know what it costs us? Our life. And when we don't say something, it can cost somebody else their life. Especially this morning when this young lady's talking about this organization that they go out and they're trying to show young moms that this is really, don't believe all this other hocus pocus that they're putting in front of your eyes. This is a beating heartbeat. This is a life. So make a wise choice. God's the author and the finisher of life. And that awareness is saying, be careful. Be careful what your choice is. See, when we don't meet God's divine purpose, and if we think life means all we're going to do is get up 9 to 5 and go to work and punch in and punch out, God said, you're missing it. But we don't know that unless we're in His Word, unless we understand His Word. Case in point, Mordecai, he wouldn't bow to Haman because he knew the history. He wouldn't bow to Haman because he said, Haman, man, you're all messed up. Agag was supposed to be extinct. He was supposed to be done. God said, they will be enemies of mine all the days of our life. And I shared this before. When we look at ISIS, did you know who they come from? The descendant of Agag. Because God told them and warned them, you need to terminate them, you need to exterminate them, and they didn't obey Him. They didn't follow out His word. So they're still fighting the same enemy today because they didn't follow God's voice back then. Then we go to verse 7, chapter 7, and we see that Queen Esther finally goes before the king, and she tells him, and I just want to point a couple things out because it's just super cool. So Queen Esther, she tells him, and she goes, I'm starting in verse 3, and Queen Esther, and she says to the king Xerxes, if I found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition. Finally, the petition's rolling out, and spare my people. This is my request. And she goes on, for me and my people, she said, hey, if we would have been slaves, if anything that would have happened, that's fine. But no, they want to exterminate us. They want to kill us. They want us to get rid of all of us, women and children. Now, her King Xerxes, he turns around and he asks the queen, who is he? Who is this man who wants to do this to you? And not only does he say, who is he says, where is he? Well, guess who came for dinner, right? Who was invited to dinner? Haman. Haman is for dinner. He's one of the guests. She turns around, verse 6. Esther said, an adversary, an enemy, this vile Haman, the second in charge. This is the man that we're talking about. Verse 7, the king got up in a rage. He left his wine. He went on to the palace garden. But Haman, now watch this, but Haman, realizing that the king had already decided his fate, he stayed behind and he threw himself, he says, he threw himself on Queen Esther's bed, he says, and he went to beg Esther for his life. So Esther was lounging on a big bed, and Haman, he's begging her, he throws himself there, and he's begging her. Then the king comes back, he returns from the palace garden to the banquet hall, And he turns around, he says, Haman was falling on the couch with Esther was reclining on. And the king says, will he even molest my queen while she's with me in my house? But that's not what she was doing. That's not what Haman was doing. Haman was begging for his life. But when the king came in, what did it look like? Like, what are you doing, man? Get away from my wife. This ain't good for you. But that's the way it appeared. God's divine appointment, the way God placed everything, and we see this like, wow. Here's a little further. As soon as that word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Haman didn't get to say, wait a minute, I was begging for my life. He didn't get none of that. They covered his mouth and they took him away. Haman couldn't say anything. Look how all this is synchronized. Look how all this came together. And we look at this beautiful story and we're like, wow. And in this beautiful story, you know what it does? It wakes us up to say, Lord, my life belongs to you. You have a divine purpose. You have a divine reason, place, time that you want me to show up, that you want me to be here. Ron and I had no idea when we went to do marriage counseling with this young man and with his wife, that years later he would say, you know what? We want to bless your ministry. That had nothing to do with anything. It had to be with us surrendering, submitting our lives to one thing, to God's agenda. To God's agenda. So we turn around. I'm going to step right behind you and grab my phone. So when we see God's agenda, and it's totally different than ours, and we have to understand, we have to submit our lives to God. Chad, right? Chad? Amanda? Am I right? I'm no good at names. The day that we went out for walks, we prayed in the neighborhood. Some people, well, that's not my thing. That's not for me. But some people went out, and the kids went out, and someone talked to you and invited you to church. That's why you came. You and your bride came because they were invited. Because that divine appointment that God said, he says, you know what? I don't want you sitting home on Sunday anymore. I want you to part of something that I'm doing, something that I'm stirring. Raise your hand, coach. Right over here. Raise your hand right there, right? God's divine purpose, God's divine timing, saying, hey, I don't want to just bring you somewhere. We're going to make a life-changing difference because I called you, because I'm placing you. See, that's what this story is about. God saying, hey, if we think we're just going to sit here on our morals and just have religion, God says, it's not about that. You know, when I put an 85-screen-inch TV out there, and it's okay. I had some people say, hey, you're going overboard. No, I'm not. God told me I'm bringing the people. God said I'm going to fill the people. You know what I was doing? I was preparing for them to come. And they thought I'd like big screen TVs. I do. I like watching when the Packers win on big screen TV. Not so fun when they lose. Now, listen. But here's the thing. Preparing because we're expecting. Now, the other day we're sitting at my table and we have an elders meeting and God had a word. And I told him, I'm going to share it with you now. He had said to me, when we were 12 people, Rhonda and I being 13 and 14, at a small church that grew, we seated 80 people. God had said, third Sunday, I'm standing on the chair. He said, I'm going to bring people, and I'm going to fill all these chairs. And he says, bring all the chairs up from the basement, every office. I'm going to fill them, and I'm going to fill them even more. And I'm like, man, I don't want to do that. Because if it don't happen, I'm going to look pretty foolish. And he said, bring them up. Because God said this, when we stand in his expecting, I expect you to show up, Lord, because your word says it. I'm expecting you to deliver because you say you're gonna. He said to me, Rob, you stand in the expecting, so I show up. Folks, we need to stand in the expecting, and he will show up. We have to stand in, Lord, I know that you're going to be here. I know you're going to show up. That's powerful. Standing in the expecting, knowing that our God will show up. Some of us are stuck into religiosity and don't know what the favor and the intimacy, what Jesus Christ is. You're missing it. You're going to miss the most intimate, beautiful time experience that you could have right now. I'm telling you right now, that church was 14. It was 580 when we left. That was the Holy Spirit. We came to church one day, and we're like, well, they must have a rummage sale. We're by the fairgrounds. They must have a horse show today. People were lying down the block waiting to come in the church. And I said, what are they coming to church? What's going on? Brand new church. And they're lined up down the road because the Holy Spirit was in the stirring. We just showed up. The Holy Spirit was saying, because you expect me to. Folks, our mindset has to come, Lord, I am standing in the expecting. I'm standing in the expecting, Lord. This company, when they came, the storm quarry, when they were in troubled times, and God said, hey, go out in the four corners and pour the oil in each corner and pray over your property and know that I'm coming because I'm God. They stood in the expecting, and God showed up, and they sold it for millions of dollars. Standing in the expecting. See, if we turn around and it's about religiosity, man, you haven't even taken it out of first gear. I'm driving in fifth. And you're like, shh, well, catch up. Hang on. Get on board even better. Get on board. But God is doing something special. And I want to give you one last thing. When we left, we didn't understand it either. But we have 50, 60 calls who say, you know what? We didn't understand what was going on. We didn't understand the season or the time. I don't think we did either. And they said, we didn't understand. Folks, I'm just telling you, grab a hold. God is doing something special here. And you can sit, and there's different kinds of people. Those who watch what happened, those who wonder what happened, and those who make it happen. I'm standing in the making it happen because I'm standing with my King. But don't be those wondering what's happening. Those who just say, oh, that's good. It's a warm, fuzzy church. Nah, get in there and make it happen. God's stirring. You need to get in the groove. We need to wake up. We need to say, Lord, I want to be on your page. Lord, I want to be on your agenda. That's what this beautiful story is about. And we open it up, and she's saying, Mordecai's saying, hey, Esther, you've got a responsibility. Hey, Water's Edge, you have a responsibility. We need to wake up. We need to get on the right page. It's great that you like the story. What's your story look like? What does your story look like? Where's your engagement? What's your journey? What's your role? What's your assignment? And if you're just a bystander and you're not moving, that's between you and God, but he's not impressed. We need to be on his page. We need to be on his agenda. I'm going to finish with this. Russ, I'm going to tell him what God gave me for you last night. I was here, we're in prayer last night, and God said, tell him. Tell Russ and tell the church this. And I went to Russ, and I'm overwhelmed because God kept telling me and over and over and over. And we had a beautiful time of prayer. And he said this. He said, listen, I've given you a warrior's heart. And with that warrior's heart, I want you to protect this Wings of Refuge and our golf outing. I want you to protect these children, these kids that are being kidnapped, these boys and these girls. And he says, I don't want to see smoke. I want to see a fire. And in that care, I gave it to your church, Water's Edge. So we need to say, you know what? God gave us an assignment. And that assignment is we need to watch out for these children that are being kidnapped, these young girls, these young boys. And he's given us this golf outing to use. I don't play golf, but I'm going to show up. And I'm going to help. And I'm going to tell everyone I can. But God is saying, you got a responsibility. So he gives this message for me to give to Russ. He's saying, listen, I don't want it to be smoke, because a fire that's smoking is fire that's not burning. He says, I want to see a fire. I don't want to see a Dell light. I want to see a spotlight. I want to see a beacon. God is saying, I'm trusting it to you, man who I put a warrior's heart in, but I'm trusting it into the care of Water's Edge. We need to wake up. That's a beautiful responsibility that God said, I'm trusting this in your care. We need to say, this is a big deal. What am I doing to help? This is a big deal. How am I engaged? Do you get it? God's on the move. And you have to decide, am I watching what's happening? Am I wondering, or am I alongside of him making something happen? That's the presence and the Spirit of God. We need to grab a hold of that, or you'll live a life of regret and just scratch your head and say, how come I haven't? What happened? And watch your life go by. God has an assignment, and we need to be in that assignment. And I'm not offended. I don't care what people think. Put out the TV because God said they're coming. Prepare that room as an overflow. And then we have a guy who 8 years ago saying, God put something on my spirit. And his wife, and Ron was a youth leader in their cabin. We want to bless you. Pretty cool, huh? That's God. He knew 8 years ago where we were going to stand today. But I don't want to stand and doing nothing. I want to be busy doing what God's called me to do. Isn't that a beautiful thing? Let's stand and worship together.